Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. Today I'm going to make some giant riding snails for Dungeons and Dragons and a racing track for the Wild Beyond the Witchlight.
The grandstands next to this racecourse are filled with cheering fairgoers, ringing bells, singing rattles and waving flags. On the starting line, 8 giant snails are having their shells scrubbed by pixies. Above the circular course, a wooden gantry hangs from the branches of a central tree, where 2 goblins officiate the proceedings.
The giant snails seem like a great mount idea for me, and if they don't appear later in the adventure, I'm going to include them. So I thought I may as well build a few of those.
Firstly, I went to Thingverse. I found a 3D model of Upper's saddle from Avatar The Last Airbender and a snail that would work just fine. I bought all these into Chitterbox and started to kitbash them together. Using the wooden floors from the OpenForge 2.0 wooden floors set again to make the base, I put together a basic saddle and seat on top of the snail. I tried to add some more support to the saddle, and then I bought in a couple of scale size miniatures to make sure that my minis would fit happily on these bases. Once complete, I exported it as an STL and then re-imported. I then hollowed and added supports to the models ready to print on my Elegoo Mars 2 printer. I also made a slightly different version of the saddle just to have some variation on the field. I printed these off in resin using my Elegoo Mars 2 printer. I then UV cured them and gave them a prime with a cheap grey spray paint. I then coated them with Citadel Wraithbone White in the spray can. This colour was designed to take the contrast paints that I intend to use to paint these models. I grabbed a selection of contrast paints, starting off with a skeleton horde, striping my way along the shell to add a spiral effect. I then moved up to a snakebite leather to add a darker tone. I then used a Cygor Brown 50-50 mix and Gore-Grunter Brown to paint the saddle. I then took these darker colours and added them to the shell, continuing to spiral my way into the centre. After this, I came in with an Agrax Earth Shade. This was to add in some more shadow to the recesses of the shell. I experimented with the different greys on the different snails' bodies. The Space Wolf Grey was my favourite, it really added that Feywild touch. I then touched up the underbody with a Basilicanum Grey. So for each snail I approached them differently. I gave the bodies a different base, a different grey, and I coloured each of the shells with a different technique. This one here is using a green ink and it came out pretty nicely. I find that batch painting this kind of thing is a really good time to experiment with paints that I don't use that often. And now to go back and paint the saddles that I missed on the last 2 with some Gore-Grunter Brown and a 50-50 Cygor mix. And after spilling that Cygor mix, I decided to add a little bit more into this plain brown shell. So if we go back to the reference art, we can see that all the snails are draped in coloured cloth. So to tackle that, we're going to take some scraps of tissue and add some UV resin. Once the resin's soaked in, you can shape the cloth and use a UV torch to harden it. This is just the same resin that I use for my 3D printer. Once these are all set, I can base them in a grey primer. I then repeat this for each of the snails, trying to add some variation in the placement of the cloths. Make sure you're using a throwaway brush because this will probably be destroyed in the process. The UV resin left a glossy finish on the shells, so I sprayed the snails with an anti-glare matte varnish. After this, I came back in with a gloss finish to add the sliminess back to the snails' bodies. Once all the flags were done, I painted on some rope.
So another option here instead of the resin and paper towel method is using green stuff or milliput. I just don't have any available to me right now, so this was the easiest option at the time.
Next, I took out my contrast paint and started adding colour. According to the source material, we have a pink, blue, purple, green, yellow, orange, red and black team. So it looks like I'm painting Nimblefoot, Flower Flash and Breakneck. So on my next batch of snails, I just went straight in with the Snakebite Leather Contrast Paint. It does a great job on the shells and really fills in the gaps. I came back in with the Cygor 50/50 mix and the Gore Grunter Brown to finish up the saddles, and used a few different grey contrast paints on the skin. Coming back in with the dry brush of Towel Light Ochre just to add some highlights back into the saddles. And finally, adding in the flags. I will note that I really should have been wearing gloves during this, and I was wearing a mask while doing the UV curing.
This remixed model will be available for free on Thingiverse, and the link will be in the description for this video.
So now that I had the snails, it was time to build the stadium. After getting some Thingiverse designs and having several failed prints, I managed to get a grandstand that I was happy with. I primed it with the same basic grey and then hit it with a brown spray paint. Another Thingiverse design that I'll have linked in the description is the sun, moon and stars that I printed out and used to make the decoration on the back of the grandstands. I just glued them onto some coffee stir sticks before giving them a base grey primer. And then finishing them off with a metallic bright gold spray paint. Now using some hot glue, I can attach these to the back of the grandstands, and I've got the perfect style for the Wild Carnival. If we go back to the source material, above the course a wooden gantry hangs from the branches of a central tree, where two goblins officiate the proceedings. So I guess we need to find a treehouse and build some barriers. I jumped onto tinkercad and built up a basic shape for the ring around the tree in the center. I printed out the barriers using my Ender 3, gave them a basic primer. I then sprayed them with a Tamiya color brown spray paint. Then I found a nice treehouse design on Thingiverse and printed it out. I gave it the usual prime and wraithbone spray, and then continued to paint it with contrast paints. So I came in with the base green for the top, and then Cygor brown for the base of the tree. I used Skeleton Horde contrast paint on the steps to give them a light tone, as I had an intention of adding colour later on. I used the same colour for the platform as the steps. Once this had dried, I came in with a Towel Light Ochre dry brush onto the wooden section to bring out the highlights. I then decided to use a Druchii Violet shade to add some more colour to the Feywild magic of this tree. In the end, it all came together brilliantly. We've got the snail races with our mountable snails, our treehouse for the goblins to call the race, and our crowd cheering from the sides. Now, all that's left is getting some adventures into the carnival and seeing how they go in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Well, with the ring toss and now the snail racing complete, that's 2 punches of our ticket. What should we do next at the Witchlight Carnival?